the two handouts. There's two of them, a long piece of paper and a short one. Okay. So, why are we doing this? Why did I decide to do this? Well, a couple of years back, I got interested in looking again at the life and the theology of Paul, and what Paul taught as a Pharisaic Jew who had experienced a very mystical experience with the risen Jesus. Remember, Paul did not know Jesus as a human being, a person. Paul's experience with Jesus was a mystical one on the road. Okay, so I got interested in Paul, and so while I'm reading through some of Paul's theology, it became obvious to me that one of the things he was trying to do was sort of synthesize the religion of his childhood, growing up as a Pharisaic and very well educated and very learned student of his Hebrew Bible. Okay, now Paul's a Pharisee, so that he understood what we call the Old Testament. Paul would look at all of those books as scripture. Remember, there were other groups who said, no, only the first 5 books, what they call the Torah, are the actual scriptures. The other stuff are important writings. But Paul would have said all of that is scripture. But that a lot of Paul's theology comes, guess what? Not so much out of the prophets or the Psalms, but out of the Torah. And what is the Torah? The first 5 books. It means the law. That's what Jews call the first 5 books. We call it the Pentateuch. They call it the Torah. So I thought, well, gee whiz, you need to go back and read those 5 books. So late last year, I set about going through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Right now I'm in the first part of Numbers, which I actually think is more boring than the book of Leviticus. But I thought, I need to read it for myself, because it's one thing to hear allusions or references to it, because it is mentioned in Paul's writings, and Jesus referenced it too. But I thought, I really need to read this, and not only just read it, I need to dig into it and understand it. So what I do, in my Bible reading, I find a good commentary, and then I basically read a chapter a day. And I started at Genesis, worked my way through Exodus, and then I got to Leviticus. Okay? And then this is the commentary I used for Leviticus. And then one of them I got out of our library, etc., etc. But anyway, that's so I got to Leviticus, which really is so much a part of Paul's rethought theology. And I thought, you know what? This would be good for all of us, because how many of you, I know Mary said she just reread Leviticus, and somebody else I know said they read, but seriously, how many of you may have read it or may have read it once? I'm sure I read it and looked at it in seminary, but to be very honest with you, Leviticus is not one of my go-to books. Is it yours? Yeah. And why would that be? Why would that be? John?
The first part is all how to do animal
sacrifices. Yeah, and we're going to talk about that. But and it's just like, okay, first of all, it kind of makes my stomach churn. Second of all, it's hard to say. I don't understand what. So I thought this would be a good way to just give you a pretty high-level overview of Leviticus and what's in it, because I guess most of you are just going to be a little bit shocked at what we talk about. All right. So let's pray, and then we're going to get into it, because we're only going to do this for 2 Sundays. All right. So let us pray. Gracious God, now as we look at ancient scriptures, Jesus' Bible, Paul's Bible, God, help us today to see something we haven't seen before, to hear what we need to hear. Lord, so that we could better understand who you really are and experience your grace and loving kindness poured out into the world and into our lives. This we ask through Jesus Christ. Amen. Okay, so I have a little outline there, and what I'm going to do, my goal is today is I want to work through the description of the 5 sacrifices, okay? I want to at least get that far, okay? So, first of all, let's talk about that first section, background, blah, 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 blah. So, the title of the book, Leviticus, anybody have any idea what that Hebrew word might mean? Anybody? Well, I'm told that it's basically the first 3 or 4 words of the book in Hebrew, where it says, and God called, or called to Moses. Now, from that, also, that word Leviticus, remember there's a tribe of Israelites named after Levi, one of the sons of Abraham, Jacob. Remember that? And that there's 12 tribes, and one of the tribes, they're all named after those sons, and one of the tribes is Levi. So it's all about the Levites who became, what important role did that particular tribe have in the life of the Israelites?
Priests.
Exactly. Not all Levites were priests, okay, but all priests were Levites. Does that make sense? You had to come. Why? Because Aaron was a part of the tribe of Levi. Aaron, the brother of Moses, and Aaron was the very first priest. Okay, and then his sons became like associate priests. But all the priests had to come from the tribe of Levi. It was a bloodline thing. Okay? So the book of Leviticus, it means and God called to Moses, and then became the name of the tribe. Okay? Enough of that. Now, it is the 3rd book in the Hebrew Torah. What it describes, Genesis is a way to talk about the creation of the world. It talks about the call of Abram before they were Jews, the call of Abram and Sarai. Remember, they were the matriarch and patriarch of 3 major world religions, of what they call the Abrahamic religions. Later on, and then it goes through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then what happened to that next son, Joseph? He went down into Egypt. Remember, his horrible brothers sold him off into slavery. He went down into Egypt, and there he prospered. Became a diviner and a dream interpreter. He prospered, and he became like the right hand to Pharaoh. While he was there, many Hebrews came forth, right? And they became like second-class citizens, slaves and servants to the Egyptians. And one of those was a little baby boy named Moses, okay? And it was Moses who rallied those people and brought them out of Egypt, right? And that's the book of Exodus. That's what happens in the book of Exodus. It's all about the plagues and getting out of Egypt and getting on the road to the promised land, right? And then while that's happening, what happens to Moses? He goes up on Mount Sinai, and what happens there? Then he hears commandments, and then he also hears God saying, and by the way, you're going to what? You're going to build a portable sanctuary for me, right? And that portable sanctuary has always been called the tabernacle, right? The tabernacle. It was made out of tents. It was a giant, partially a tent, right? The book of Leviticus is all about that tent, the tent of meeting, and what was to happen in there, because that's where the worship life of the Israelites, the wandering Israelites, happened. So their first sanctuary as a Hebrew people was not in Egypt. It was out in the wilderness. It was a large portable tent, okay? Which, if you'll look at your giant cheat sheet, let me go get one for myself. Anybody need one? Everybody got one? Okay, so this I got out of a library book, but this is a drawing based on the description. And by the way, Moses was told how to build the tabernacle really in the book of Exodus, but it's the book of Leviticus when he says, okay, now once you get that thing built, this is what you're going to do inside of it. But if you look, there's an outer, you see the outer, they were made of cloth, like a fence. That's not a wooden fence, that's cloth, okay? And it's described exactly the measurements and everything, okay? And then you'll notice, if you look down to the left, there's 4 colored, that's the entrance. Those are the entrance, that's how you got in there, okay? Now anybody, if you're an Israelite, anybody could come into that open area, okay? Where could they not go? They could not go into the tented part. And there's 2 sections to that. Do you see it? There's an outer section where that menorah candle thing is. And then there's another section that's walled off with a curtain. And what was that inner room called? The Holy of Holies. Who got to go into the Holy of Holies? The high priest. Only the high priest. One time per year. Okay? But anybody, all the Israelites could come into this, what they call the tent of meeting. But only the priest or the high priest could go into that next section, and only the high priest could go into the Holy of Holies. Okay? And then you'll see some of the furnishings. Let's look outside first. Do you see that first big square thing? That was like a big grill, okay? That's where the bodies of the animals were burned. They were butchered. What you don't see, there were butchering tables all around, and the animals were butchered there, but they were burned on that giant square table. Okay? And then the next thing up is another smaller square thing. That's the, I think they call it the brazen altar. But that's where the blood of the animals was placed there. And then the high priest or the priests then would take the buckets of blood. It's going to get grosser, people. Okay. They could then go through the next tent, into the next tent. And once they got inside there, they threw blood on that tall square thing. They would sprinkle blood and throw blood all over that. Okay? Now, back up real quick. That lampstand, that's intricately described in the book of Exodus. And that was a continuing remembrance of the presence of God. Okay? To the side was called the table of the bread of presence. And there were always, I think there were 5 loaves that were put there every day. And the priests could eat that bread, but nobody else could. And you remember there was an incident that David went in there? David went in there and grabbed the bread when he was hungry, remember? But because he was king, nobody said anything, but he grabbed the bread because his men were hungry. And Jesus mentions that and stuff. Anyway, so any questions about that? So when we talk about this stuff, I hope having seen this, that'll help you to get it in your mind's eyes how this thing worked. Now, just to the right, that picture there with the man in the funny clothes, that is the high priest, not a priest. That is the high priest, who was Aaron. Aaron was high priest until he died, and he dies midway through Numbers. But at any rate, his garments or his vestments, again, are described in the book of Exodus. When God is telling Moses, you're going to build the tabernacle this way, it's going to be this size, and you're going to build it out of wood and out of gold, and it's going to be this, it's all there. He also describes how the high priest, the vestments, okay? An inner vestment and outer vestment. One of the most interesting things that I find about this, you see that little square thing on his chest? And there's 12 jewels in it. Those 12 jewels represent the 12 tribes of Israel. Inside that thing, that amulet, is something called the Urim and the Thummim, I think is how you pronounce it. You know what those were? They were divinatory. It was an instrument of divination. So when they didn't know what to do, the high priest, only the high priest, could use whatever, however it worked, we're not sure, inside that breast piece were the Urim and the Thummim, and then they would, I think it was something like almost throwing dice, and they would say, then however it falls, that's God's will. But only the priest could do that, and it was on his vestments. And then you see that he has a censer with incense and stuff. Okay. And one final thing, then we'll move on. Okay, if you look, it's hard to see because of the photocopy, but again, in the book of Numbers, not in the book of Exodus or in the book of Leviticus, but I'm reading in the book of Numbers where each tribe is told they are to camp, whether on the east, the west, the north, or the south. Okay? But they were given specific instructions where they were to be encamped around the tabernacle. Okay? Now, real quick, some theology about it. The idea here, the theology in the book of Leviticus is this idea of the localized presence of God. Not all of God, but some kind of localized presence within the encampment, some presence, a powerful presence of God was said to be around the ark. The ark was thought to be like the throne of God on earth. And that's why only the high priest could go in there, and only once a year. Okay? But the idea was that I will be with you and in your midst. I will be there, and it's a way, the idea was a way to say, I'm holy, you're not, I'm different, I'm very different from you. And then, of course, there was the pillar of the cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. Okay? So when they were on the move, a cloud hovered supposedly around the tabernacle as it was carried on poles. Everything was rolled up. And by the way, there was another tribe that their whole job was to pack up and move stuff and set it up. And they would, but the cloud would be there by day and the pillar of night. Okay, but the idea of the localized presence of God there. So the book of Leviticus can be compared to sort of like a manual for worship, in part. A manual for worship. These are the sacrifices you're going to do. These are the animals that you will do for that particular sacrifice, and that particular sacrifice you will do because of this thing. And it describes what the offerer, the person bringing the animal, has to do. By the way, people think the priest killed the animal. They didn't. If you brought the animal, whether it was a bird or a cow, you had to kill it. You had to, and they killed it by slitting the neck. You had to put your hand on it, because that conveys your sins, you on your animal, and you had to kill it. And then once it was dead, I believe the people had to butcher it. But then it was the priest who then would manage the burning altar. And only the priest could take the blood into the tabernacle. Okay? All right. The idea there, again, is to help. And all through the book of Leviticus, if you've read it, he's trying to, whoever wrote it, is trying to teach people the difference between clean and unclean. The idea that some things are also holy and some things are. And by holy, it means set apart for holy or religious purposes. Okay? It becomes holy by virtue of the fact that you're going to use it as for sacred purposes, okay? Clean and unclean is a little bit different, okay? So a clean thing could be used for holy purposes, but no unclean thing could ever be. And some clean things that become unclean can be made clean again by sacrifices, okay? But there are such things like unclean animals that will never be made clean, and they were never to be used in sacrifices. But a lot of it is like, this animal is clean, that's clean, you're to eat this, and you can't eat that. And it goes into excruciating details about what's clean, what is unclean, okay? So that's the theology, this idea of you're going to be my people, and the world will know it by the things you do and don't do, and the food you eat and the food you don't eat, and how you handle sacred things, okay? Any questions about that? Okay. All right. Okay, moving along. By the way, the other thing I would say that the priests not only functioned as religious officiants, they were the ones that took the blood into the tabernacle and all that. They were also public health officers. They functioned as public health officers. Because the priests were taught what's clean and unclean. They were taught to look at diseases and skin diseases and determine what was really bad and what wasn't. And if you had it, and then they could declare when you don't have it. Remember Jesus said, go to the priest, show yourselves to the priests. That was all part of that. So they were not only religious officials, they were public health officers. So they had very important. The priests were the elite. Okay? All right. Okay, moving right along. Now, who wrote it? Well, people say, oh, Moses wrote it. No, it doesn't say Moses wrote it. It says Moses heard from God, heard these things from God. But never does it say Moses, number one, could read or write. But he heard these things. But somebody wrote this stuff down. Which brings me to this theory that I did learn in seminary. And I'm not going to bore you with all the excruciating details. But basically the theory says most of the Torah can be attributed, all 5 books can be attributed to at least 4 sources. Okay? And what are those sources and how do so one source uses the word for God as Yahweh. Another source talks about God as Elohim, which by the way is plural. God is a plural God. Another source is what we believe the priestly source. In other words, the priests themselves had a part in all this. Because they understood the protocol, that the chief priest, or maybe one of the really good literate priests, wrote a lot of this stuff down. And then the final source is called the Deuteronomist. Okay? The Deuteronomist source. And scholars can tell by the writings where these things came from. And that theory came from a German guy. And it's still widely held and accepted. Okay, so that was the JEDP or the Wellhausian theory. So who wrote it? Chances are good Moses did. At one point it reports, and Moses died. So it wasn't Moses writing it down. Moses heard these things. Moses reported these things. Moses told the people about these things. But it doesn't mean Moses wrote these 5 books. Okay? All right. Enough about that. Let's talk about what's in here. So what I want to talk about now are, let's look at the sacrifices. And by the way, if you look on your paper, you see where it says purification blood offerings? Somehow or another, that should be over. That's another one of them. I don't know what I did. I indented something. But there's actually 5 of them. So purification blood offering should be one of those. It looks like it's part of peace offerings. It's not. Okay? So, in a nutshell, in this book, Moses says there will be 5 different kinds of sacrifices conducted within this portable tabernacle. Okay? So they involve animals, and one involves grain offering. Okay? The first one that he talks a lot about is the burnt offering. And then I named the animals that could be used for this one. They had to be perfect. No blemishes. Okay? And they had to be males. Okay? So you could use perfect male cattle, sheep, goats, and birds. Okay? Now, the burnt offering, it was for sin. Okay? When someone has sinned, this sacrifice was made as a way to confess to God and to get God's forgiveness, okay? And again, had to be offered in the tabernacle. You cannot conduct sacrifices outside the tabernacle. You got to do it in-house, right? Got to do it there. The burnt offering, it's the most common. It is to atone for sin. And this is, for all of us who love animals, here's the thing. The idea was the wrath of God is poured out upon the animal instead of the person who sinned. Okay? So the cutting of its throat and the draining of its blood and the dismembering and the burning is to be a way of, you put your hand on that thing and then that thing suffers in your place for the sin you've committed. Okay?
Jim, did they eat the offerings?
Some. Good question. Not the burnt offerings.
What do they do with it? It's how to eat that.
They burn it to bits, and then there's instructions about. Then you go throw these pieces out in the camp, outside the camp, and yeah, it gets pretty. It's like reading a butchering manual. But at any rate, some you could. Marie brings up a good point. Some only the priest could eat, and one of them that we'll talk about, the people could eat. But the burnt offerings, nobody got to eat anything. It was just your firstborn male, perfect ox. It was burned on the altar, and that was it. Okay. And it happened every single day. There was a burnt offering and a cereal offering every day. So can you imagine the animals that they went through, killing and burning every single day? My guess would be, unless they were traveling and the tent wasn't set up, you couldn't do it. Jeff?
So then, how often do you submit your sacrifice? Every day?
Some as needed, but the burnt offering was just, they did that every day for sin. It happened every single day. Sometimes, no. Sometimes multiple times. There was different offerings for different individuals, but this thing was done every day, almost on behalf of the whole community. Okay? Good question. Next one, and again, the offerer, the hands had to be put on the head of the animal, and then the offerer had to slit the poor thing's throat, and then take it over to the butchering table and do all that stuff. Okay. This is mentioned, we think, a few times in the New Testament scriptures. The book of Hebrews, anybody know about the book of Hebrews in the New Testament? We don't know who wrote it. Some people think Paul did. Most people think it was more like a student of Paul. The book of Hebrews is all about saying, well, that's what it said in the book of Leviticus, and it's a reinterpretation of the sacrificial system in the book of Leviticus. But it references the book of Hebrews. There's several places where the book of Hebrews references the book of Leviticus. Okay? We'll talk more about that, but it references back. The next offering is called the cereal offering. The cereal offering. These were offerings of grain, produce and grain. Now this part, the priests were allowed, so when you did a burnt offering, you had to bring a cereal offering, because the priest got to eat, right? So the priest could eat the part of it that was not burned on the brazen altar. And I think the rule was 20% of it had to be burned, and 80% could remain behind, and the priest could use it to make things or to eat. Okay? I'm trying to see, why did we do the cereal offerings? What did I say here? The cereal offering wasn't necessarily for sin. It was a gift to God. So you've atoned for my sin, now I'm just giving you a sacrifice that it doesn't involve killing an animal. It's a gift to you and to your priests. So the cereal offering was more like a free will gift and offering to God, and they could eat it. All right? So it wasn't about killing in the wrath. Make sense? It was a gift to God. Hey, God, thank you for my crops. And to show you, I'm giving you this, and the priests get to eat. It's sort of like the tithe, and the priest can eat part of that. Make sense? Okay, moving right along. The next offering is called the peace offering. The peace offering. And again, Marie, this is one where the priest could retain part of the animal to eat. Okay? That's why birds were not allowed, because, not a lot of meat on a bird. So birds were not a part of this. The priests were like, no, you got to bring some big stuff in, okay? I'm trying to see, I know. The kidneys, okay, here's some gross stuff. The kidneys, the fat, and the intestines, and the liver, you couldn't eat those. Those are organ meats. You couldn't eat those. They had to be burned. So all that stuff had to go, but the rest of it you could eat. Okay? It was like a sacred meal. Okay, sacred meal. It's thought that Paul may have looked at that peace offering sacrifice in a way as a predecessor to communion. We don't know for sure, but some have argued for that. But again, it was a way of asking for God's blessing, giving a gift to God and to the priest, because remember, most all of it could be eaten. Only the organ meats were burned. Next one is the purification blood offering. This happened, this was a specific sacrifice so that when things that were clean, to restore unclean things back to their cleanness. For example, this is a purification offering. After a woman had a child, childbirth, after a person was healed from a skin disease, the idea is after you had that, you gave your thanks to God, and it was a way of saying what was unclean has become clean again. And there's more things that you could do. Does that help? It's a purification. It purifies what was unclean back to its clean status. And also, so in a way, it's not like intentional sin and wrongdoing. It's unintended. It just happened. Nobody wants to get a disease. Or maybe the disease didn't happen because you did something wrong. It just happened, right? So this was a way of that becoming whole again, giving thanks to God, and for it to be sort of ritually named clean again. All right? Make sense? All right. And you could use female animals for that.
Why?
I think it has something to do with the childbirth thing. There's some connection there, because part of it was making women purified again, so being a female animal. Okay, and then the final one is called reparation guilt offering. Reparation guilt offering. And again, by the way, you guys, the peace offerings could be eaten by the offerers too. Okay, that's why it's sometimes considered like a fellowship meal or communion meal. Sorry, I didn't mention that. But that's the only one. That's the only one of the sacrifices that the people could eat, is the peace offerings. But in this reparation offering, again, the priest could eat part of it. They could eat part of it. Only two kinds of animals, though, could be used for this one. So there's specific animals for each one of these, or grain. This one, only lambs and rams for a reparation offering, and only the priest could eat it. This sacrifice was specifically done for when a person sins against sacred property or screws up protocol. Okay? It's unintended, they didn't mean to, it just happened, okay? And so that's what this was used for. It's messing up the sacred rules and rituals. As far as we know, there's no reference to this in the New Testament. As far as we know. So those are the 5 different sacrifices that went on in the tabernacle. So you can see that largely, and this was probably true for a lot of those ancient cultures, worship was centered upon sacrifice, mostly animal sacrifice. But it was a way of the people bringing forth, killing things to hold off God's wrath on them, and that God's wrath then would be redirected, if you will, upon the animal. Okay. We don't know early on, it doesn't talk about singing or preaching, because Moses was the prophet, while they were wandering. Moses was the prophet. Aaron was the priest. But you don't hear about other elements of worship that are familiar to us, or that came later once the temple in Jerusalem was established. It really was all about this portable butcher shop and the stuff they did in there. Okay, how many of you knew all that? John?
Speaking of that, so when they did have the temple and Passover, did they sort of like, okay, instead of like doing this, the big ones on a daily basis, we're going to do this once a year on Passover, and all families bring your one?
John, that's a great question I was thinking about this morning. One of the theories is that the sacrificial system that is referenced in the New Testament, how much did it reflect what went on in the tabernacle? How did it change? Did it change? I don't know, and that's one of the things I want to explore this coming week. How did it change? The theory is that it did, and that most of what we read about in the New Testament is largely the cereal offering and the peace offerings. I don't know. I don't know.
They had the big sacrifice.
Yeah.
Every family bring your cow for your family for
Yeah.
that.
I don't know. I don't know exactly. And there's scholars who think that Jesus criticized all of it. That was one reason why he overturned the tables in the temple when he came in, because they were selling birds and these animals, and he was just done with the whole thing.
And this is
for
also
profit.
why it took them 40 years
Yeah.
to go on a journey that
Just taking the tent down took forever, right?
Well, also,
Yeah.
40 for a
Yeah.
journey that you look on the
And
map that
they had to be raising those animals so when they would camp, they wouldn't camp for one night. They probably camped for years in one place, or at least months. It wasn't like they just picked up every day and went on. They had to raise those animals. They had to raise the food. So you can see why it took 40 years or so to get to the land. They were nomadic people, but that doesn't mean they moved every night or every week or even every month. Does that make sense? Okay. So it was portable, but it probably stayed in place for a long while as they moved, because they had to get all these animals from someplace. All right. But I want to follow up and see what scholars know about the sacrificial system in the temple at the time of Jesus. It probably was not. It probably didn't look like what we see in Leviticus. But I'm going to find out. But that's a great question, and I don't know the answer.
Did they know why, after the temple was burned, they didn't sacrifice anything?
Because there was no temple.
I mean, the Jewish people, their whole religion changed.
Yeah, because there was no temple. When the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, all that stopped. And that's when they went to
Synagogues.
Yom Kippur and synagogue and all those things. It changed because there's been no sacrifices since 70 AD. And one of the thoughts among some people is, oh, there's going to be another temple and they're going to do this sacrificial system again and all that. But yeah. All right, what time is it? Is it about noon, I'm guessing?
It's 12:03.
Okay, so that's enough. That's what I wanted to get through today, because all this other stuff is related to it. But just know, there were 5 kinds of sacrifices, different animals were used. Not all, you couldn't eat all of the remainder of the sacrifices. Some you could, some you couldn't. Sometimes priests could, but the only one that the people could eat was the peace offering. They could participate in that, and that it became like a fellowship or a family meal or banquet. You gave part of it to God, you got to keep the rest, and you went home and had barbecue. Okay? So next week, what I want to get into then are some more specific rules, not about the sacrifices, but where the very specific things that they were forbidden to do, it's also included in the book of Leviticus. The other thing that's there, coming at the end of it, are the festivals, the establishment of the festivals, the spring festivals and the harvest festivals. That's in the book of Leviticus also. And they mean different things, they're 4 different things. Okay? So we'll get to that also. But then I also want to help you understand what Paul, I'm going to use a big word, extrapolated from Leviticus into his, what he called his gospel, his theology, and how he tried to meld the two together and say, that was what was, this is what is. I'll try to explain that. Whether or not you agree or think that's the way it is up to you, but that's what Paul did. Okay? Make sense? Questions? Concerns? Yes. Jim?
This is a little bit off the program. On the picture of this high priest, his picture, he has a breastplate on.
That's the one I was talking about.
The other day on TV, on the channel Nova, here to Nova, they had a story about this breastplate.
Yeah.
And there was 2 modern Jewish scholars there.
Yeah.
They said this breastplate had tremendous power.
Yeah, it was thought to be magical.
And they used this power during all these sacrifices.
Yeah.
But if you use that power for a non-spiritual reason, you got put to death.
Yeah, there's a lot of people dying in here. And two of Aaron's sons, they got toasted. I can't remember what they did. But 2 of his sons, who were priests, remember Aaron's sons were priests, they did something wrong and they got blown up. Yeah. So there's a lot of that. But also some of these rules, there was a death penalty, and I've got those in there. You did this stuff, you die.
They also relate to if you your birthstone, the
Yes.
different stones. So, because I never knew my fundamentalist Christian grandmother had my birthstone and my siblings' birthstones on her jewelry.
Yeah.
And then later I found out that they were most birthstones came from the priest's garment.
Yeah. It's magical. It's thought to be magical. Yeah.
Yeah.
My mom had the same thing. She did the same thing. But yeah, Jim's right. That thing hanging from the priest was thought to be magical. And inside it were the Urim and Thummim stayed with him. By the way, there are no women priests. Stay with him. But when needed, he'd open that thing up, pull those things out, and then that was God's will. Fred, you had a question.
When did this start and what predated it?
You mean the sacrificial system?
Yeah.
Well, I would guess it probably took a long while to actually manufacture and make, because, by the way, all the cloths for the tabernacle, they had to be woven, and it was according to a very specific plan. So I'm guessing that alone, and melting the gold, people had to give up their gold stuff to melt down to coat the altars. I would say probably 4, 5, 6 years into their travel before they ever got this up and running. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know that anybody knows, but yeah, just thinking about what it would take to actually produce this tabernacle, this elaborate tabernacle for ancient peoples.
So this would have evolved at the beginning of the Exodus.
I would think after the Exodus had happened.
After that.
After Sinai and everything, they were well on their journey. Maybe, I'm guessing, a few years into that journey before they even started making the cloth and the furnishings for the inside, the stands and the woods, they all have to be dipped in gold. I mean, you can imagine how that would take. So I don't know. One final thing though. So somebody said, well, how old is this book? When do you think this book actually came together? Most scholars say probably as late as 500 years before Jesus. Before what we have now as the book of Leviticus was actually one piece. Portions of it got changed. There are times when you're reading and all of a sudden it'll go off, like, somebody who goes off on a weird tangent and you go, where are you going with? They say that's where somebody inserted something. That's why there's more than one source for this stuff. It'll go back and you didn't even use the clutch, man. I don't know where you're going with this. And that's why they say there's different sources. But they think probably what the Jews had, what Jesus' Bible, probably 500 years before the time of Jesus. So it took a long time for this to come together.
I was just thinking, I wonder if they had something to do with the diaspora when Assyria came in, kicked them out, and the Babylonians came in and kicked them out.
And
They kind of all of a sudden
Sean, that's a
needed
good
to
point.
have that together.
That's just about the time of the fall of the kingdom, and the fall of the kingdoms. Yeah, like we got to get together. We got to get our sacred scriptures together. But they would have had some of this. But the book we know as Leviticus probably never finally came together in one piece the way we have it today until the time of the diaspora, until they were taken off into slavery.
It was all oral tradition.
It's all oral tradition.
But they were pretty good at oral tradition.
Yeah. And some of it was obviously written down, but the thing we call Leviticus, or they would have had it in a big rolled up scroll, probably that wasn't done until the time of the diaspora. Yeah. All right, guys, have yourselves a wonderful, beautiful day, and we'll keep going next Sunday.